this segment, let's talk about what makes a civilization. What are the necessities? What's the characteristics that we need in order to be considered a civilization? How did we get from these hunter gatherer tribes to permanent settlements that became villages that grew into towns, cities, and eventually these massive empires? So let's think about that. How do we move from one scenario to the next? So when we're talking about hunter-gatherer tribes, right, we're talking about groups of people who lived together, moving from place to place. They were nomadic. They moved from place to place because they followed their food. That was their only way to survive. And most of their time was spent surviving, spent making sure that they had enough food, that they had shelter, right, that they were able to battle the elements around them, the environment around them. So a lot of their time was spent just on the thought of surviving. But something then happened, right? Something amazing happened that allowed these hunter gatherer tribes to then move from that to farming societies, right? And the key is the fact that they learned how to farm. They learned the idea that we can actually control or manipulate our food source. They learned how to plant crops, to have these crops available to them when they needed. They also learned how to domesticate animals, how to use animals and train animals to help them work and help them be able to survive. So once people learned to farm, three major things happened that allowed people to then grow into more than just these basic hunter gatherer societies focused on just surviving. Now they were more certain at survival because of the fact that they were able to control their food sources better, right? There was more certainty of survival, right? More people within the group can survive because it was more assured that they would have food now, right? So with more certain survival, that also allowed them to start this transition. We also talked a little bit about domestication. They were able to domesticate animals, to use those animals for their advantage, to help them to not only help plow their lands, but also to help them as a food source, right? You use goats for their milk as well to make dairy, so you were able to make other food sources. So you were able to use these animals to help you with work and as a food source. So now we had that and the farming. So that allowed us now to create permanent settlements. We no longer had to move from place to place because now we could actually control the food from where we are. If we found a favorable enough environment where we can plant our crops and we could actually domesticate and take care of our livestock, of our animals, then we were able to create permanent settlements for the first time and create these first villages where people no longer had to move from place to place. They no longer had to focus on just surviving, but now they were able to focus on other things, right? And that opens the door to the growing of a civilization. So, from these small permanent societies, we began to see an expansion of these villages and more things happening in the society rather than just farming and taking care of our livestock from the day to day just to get food, right? Because our basic farming societies still were based on that. They were still based on making sure that we were taking care of the land to grow our crops, taking care of our animals so that we had our livestock to use, right? And so it was still very much centered on that. But eventually, right, as time went on, other things began to happen in these villages. And so that leads us to these characteristics of what makes a civilization. How do we move from this simple permanent farming village that we first created to now creating a more complex society, right? Well, the first thing is that these villages then eventually had a central government, right? There had to be some kind of way to make sure that everyone living together was living in an orderly fashion, that everyone's needs were being taken care of, that things were in order, right? So there needed to be some kind of form of government. Early on, of course, are the easiest forms of government that you'll see that were usually kings, right? There was one person in charge of making sure that everything in the village was working orderly. We also then began to see a growth of cities, right? These permanent villages began to grow with more population, and you began to see more than one. So you had other settlements springing up in other places with more people living in them. So now there was a multiple amount of cities that began to grow. With the multiple amount of cities, the multiple amount of people, right? You have a lot of people farming. And once you become better at the farming and the livestock, and your supply of food seems to be steady, everybody doesn't have to be a farmer anymore, right? So that left time open, or the ability open, for people to specialize in other things. So you had people who specialized, right, in the government, those who specialized not only the king, but you also have people who were in charge of enforcing laws, people who were in charge of making sure that things were collecting taxes. So it opened the door for other forms of labor. You had merchants and traders that were able to emerge, right? And along with that, that meant that there became a class system of society, right? There was a social hierarchy, right? You had your priests and your nobles and your king at the top. And as you move down that social ladder, in a sense, right, you had more and more the people who, the larger group of people, the farmers and the merchants. And so you began to see this class system develop in society as well. Trade networks were another characteristic of a civilization. Now, your city is not only just focused on itself, but now you're taking the resources that you have and you are going out and exploring other places and being able to trade with them, right? So now you're being able to trade other types of resources and materials that you might not have. So you're opening up this system of communication with other groups of people. There's more advanced agriculture, right? Now we're getting better at farming. We're making tools to help us with farming. We understand the soil better. And with more advanced agriculture means that we can finally create some type of surplus of food. And so we are able to have more certainty of food within our city. And that also then supports the fact that that's why we have a division of labor, right, that we talked about, right? Because we have advanced agriculture, because we're better at farming, not everyone needs to be a farmer. We also have the use of metal tools, right? Before we would use things like stone or rocks that we found and kind of made these makeshift tools when we were talking about those hunter gatherer societies. But now we're learning how to manipulate and use different types of metal to make our tools better, to make them stronger, to make them last longer, as well as our weapons as well. We also established a writing system, right? This is another big characteristic, a significant characteristic of a civilization now, moving more than just a basic permanent settlement. Now we're really growing into a more complex society. Now we're developing a writing system. And most of our first writing systems developed in order to keep city records, right? That was the main purpose of developing something like a writing system early on. It kept records for the city, whether you're keeping records of the amount of food that you have stored for those months that you don't have food. You're keeping records of your trading. You're keeping records of money that's coming into play and taxes. So it first started as tax records, but eventually, right, you have this writing system that could be used for many other things, and writing down historical events that began to happen, and people began to write stories. And so the emergence of a writing system allowed for this civilization to flourish even more. There's also a development of a religious system, right? Some type of religious system. Most of our early ancient civilizations all believed in many gods. And that just gives us the idea that at one time we moved past the fact that we're no longer having to focus on just surviving from day to day. And now, with these new opportunities to have new jobs and new ways of living, this also gives us the chance to start thinking beyond just the basics, right? Thinking more in the abstract, thinking more of like what's out there and what happens when you're looking up at weather, and how does that work, and how does our world work. So when you're having these ideas that are beyond just what am I eating tomorrow or what am I eating today, it opens up these ways of being able to develop other things and other thoughts, right? So you have a development of some kind of religious system is our ninth trait of a civilization. And finally, there's a development of some type of calendar, right? Some type of way of keeping track of time, keeping track of the passage of time, right? This also marks a major part of a civilization. So these 10 characteristics are what we look at when we are studying civilizations. And you'll notice as you study different groups of people, as we study different civilizations, these are all the things that we're focusing on. We're focusing on what was their government like, right? How do they enforce law and order? What was their division of labor? What was their classes? What was part of their culture of the fact of how did they write? How do they keep time? What did they believe in? So these are all major characteristics, major things that we study in order to better understand these civilizations that emerged over time. So hopefully this kind of helped to clarify a little bit this transition from hunter-gatherer to permanent settlements and how these permanent settlements then developed into these civilizations that we will eventually take a look at as we go through our different civilizations in the course. Thank you for watching.